Okay, so now we're going to talk about the strengthening of church power, the growth of church power. And if you haven't already had a chance to take a look at the lecture on the rise of kingdoms, I strongly suggest that you do so. Make sure that you're watching both lectures because there are there's some discussion on both sides of the impacts of church on the rise of kingdoms and the impacts of kingdoms on the growth of church power. So make sure that you're spending some time covering both subjects. Now, pressure for church reform increased as more people sought a church free of secular entanglements. This is increasingly becoming an issue. The Benedictine monastery of Cluny, which was established in 910 and endowed by the Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine, was under the protection of the saints Peter and Paul through the Pope. It was renowned for its spiritual activity and prayer. It was a very famous monastery. Its abbots encouraged clerical celibacy and urged the laity to cease oppressing the poor. Their status and activity represented the reforming energy of the era. Now, some clerics in Germany and Italy, particularly in its commercial regions, began to condemn the use of practices that violated canon law. They were especially offended by clerical marriage, as well as by simony, which was the buying of church offices, and lay investiture, which was the practice of lay rulers installing clerics into their offices. They felt that this was the prerogative of the church, not of lay rulers. And these demands for reforms from these clerics began urging the use of canon law to reform the church. They were supported by Emperor Henry III, who appointed Leo IX as Pope to reform the church under his control. Which is really interesting considering that you've got these calls for reform and this desire on the part of clerics throughout the church to kind of purge the amount of lay influence on the church itself, and yet you have Henry III who's appointing the Pope as a reformer. So just kind of a little bit of irony there. Leo expanded papal power by calling church councils. He also expanded canon law and urged church reform. This was part of his program. His efforts to reestablish papal control over the Eastern Church led to the Great Schism in 1054 between Constantinople and Rome. You see this really interesting battle that goes on between the Byzantines and between the Pope in Rome over who actually controls the church, who's actually in charge here, and they wind up excommunicating each other. Leo expanded papal power by who's going back in my notes a little bit. His efforts to reform meant that he and his successors supported Norman efforts to conquer Sicily. So we have all these calls to reform, and Leo is getting involved in what might be considered secular matters. Sicily at the time was under Muslim control, and so when Leo gets involved in this episode, he actually invests, and I use that term loosely, invests the territory to Norman lords. The popes became more and more involved in military enterprises in Sicily and Spain as the Christian Reconquista of Spain intensified. And so, like I said, the Pope is becoming increasingly involved in more secular matters, and he's doing it by justifying the need to make these areas Christian. And so this is setting up kind of a political environment that we're going to see has important repercussions for Europe later on. Now, papal reform peaked during the papacy of Gregory VII. Gregory was known for, this is what his papacy was known for. He supported papal primacy. This was the supremacy of the Pope over the Church, particularly in regard to secular rulers. Gregory believed that the emperor was just another layman with no right to interfere in church matters. He was proud, he was ambitious, he was spiritually sincere, and he was single-minded. He sought to free the church from worldly influence, and he was opposed by Henry IV, as we should expect. Henry IV was the ruler of Germany and much of Italy, and saw Gregory's assertions as a threat to his own power. Henry saw the bishops that he appointed as the natural rulers of the church, and he opposed the new ideas of Gregory and the reformers. The investiture conflict began in 1075 over the appointment of the Archbishop of Milan and other Italian bishops. When Henry insisted on appointing these church offices, Gregory excommunicated him, and he authorized Henry's subjects and vassals to rebel against him. He told him, "Go ahead, do it. Henry is no longer the legitimate ruler." And you can imagine that for the princes, this was a great opportunity to undermine the control of the emperor over these regions. So faced with the threat of rebellion, Henry actually had to beg for forgiveness. And there's this great story about how Henry hears that Gregory is at this castle, and so Henry rides to this castle and puts on really humble clothing and kneels outside the walls of this castle and begs the Pope to forgive him. And Gregory has to agree. He has to agree because otherwise, what would that look like for the Pope not to agree to forgive somebody who is obviously penitent? And so on the face of it, it looks like Henry is giving in to Gregory. But in reality, both of these men are having to make concessions to one another. Now, even though Henry begged for forgiveness, tensions did not disappear. They actually continued. And Henry caused a rival pope, which historians have called the anti-pope, to be elected. Papal and imperial armies fought from 1077 to 1122 over who was actually going to be pope and over these different issues. Now, after both men's death, the Concordat of Worms in 1122 ended the conflict, at least for a time. Henry V gave up the authority to appoint clerical offices, although he continued to influence their election. The Concordat established the idea that secular and spiritual power could be separated. As the emperor was weakened, local princes and cities became more independent of imperial authority, and so we can see that there are some long-lasting impacts of this investiture conflict on the relationship between the church and between political entities, so church and state. There are some really long-lasting consequences. So just a quick little map to show you what areas we're talking about. In orange you can see the empire that we're talking about, Henry IV's empire. And you can see down in the bottom the areas, part of Sicily and that lower part of the Italian boot was under control of the Normans. Remember that they took these areas back from Muslims, and Henry IV, the Pope gave these areas over to the Normans to control. So what did reform look like in the church? Church reform went deeper than the conflicts at the top of the church hierarchy. So the clerics weren't necessarily, yes, investiture was important, but this was more of an issue at the top. But down at local levels, there were other issues that clerics were primarily concerned with. The church overall became more systematic and disciplined as a result of reform. And an important dimension to this development had to do with the increasing emphasis on the sacraments. These are those really important rituals that were considered to be saving rituals. They were necessary for people's salvation. And these sacraments were seen by many as the means by which God's grace was brought to people. For example, the church increasingly regulated and stressed the spiritual significance of marriage. Prior to this, most people didn't get married in a church. Most people underwent these sort of very secular rituals. They varied from location to location, but they oftentimes were what you might call contracts between families that united two families with the marriage of these two people. This emphasis on sacraments within the church also emphasized the importance of the Eucharist. The Eucharist, if you'll recall, is that commemoration of the Last Supper of Jesus. And we also see an increasing emphasis on the celebration of Mass. Sacramental life highlighted the importance of the priest, and so priests are becoming increasingly important in communities. And there's a new emphasis on clerical discipline, particularly priestly celibacy. This reform was not promulgated in the Eastern Church. It's important to recognize that. And it was at odds with local practice in many places. So it didn't necessarily get immediately adopted everywhere. In fact, what we see is that at the local level, some priests and some laity resisted some of these reforms. They were seen by many as being necessary to purge corruption from the church, but we still see that in local areas that it was not adopted evenly. In fact, despite opposition, in 1123, the Pope proclaimed that all clerical marriages were invalid, and he largely succeeded in enforcing the rule. So from this action, we know that a lot of clerics were still openly marrying. And even after clerical marriages were declared invalid, there's still going to be a lot of clerics, and it's hard to say how many, but we're still going to find examples of clerics who had mistresses and families, even after they were no longer able to marry. As the popes consolidated canon law and established the curia, which was a kind of church court at Rome, the papal bureaucracy and accompanying financial apparatus grew through the 11th and 12th centuries. This expanded the power of the pope and attracted criticism of the system's growing cost. The pope, with his bureaucracy, law courts, and financial apparatus, had become a monarch. So not everybody's going to like this. Now, Benedictine monasteries, such as the monks of Cluny that we've already talked about, came under growing criticism for the elaborate and opulent character of their facilities, their liturgy, and their lifestyle. So a lot of these monasteries, if you recall, a lot of people, when they die, if they have a lot of property, we have a lot of monasteries being given gifts of property and money and art and things of that nature. And so a lot of these monasteries, because they have a lot of land and they have a lot of resources, are becoming really wealthy. And people are critical of this. In contrast to the Benedictine order, the Carthusian order was founded by Bruno of Cologne. They took vows of silence and lived as hermits and spent a lot of time copying manuscripts. The Carthusians grew slowly, but the Cistercian order founded by Saint Bernard expanded rapidly, beginning at Citeaux in Burgundy in 1112 with around 30 friends and relatives. By the mid-12th century, there were more than 300 Cistercian monasteries throughout Europe, so it spread rather rapidly, even though it only began with this core group of about 30 people. Cistercians accepted Benedict's rules, but they emphasized simplicity. Monasteries had 2 houses, one with lay brothers to perform labor and a second dedicated to prayer. This is how they were structured. Their churches were all dedicated to Mary, and they emphasized God's feminine dimension and Jesus as approachable, human, and protective. Cistercian spirituality extended beyond their monasteries and influenced many, including Saint Anselm, whose theological works emphasized Jesus' humanity, the power of human charity to redeem, and the love between Christians. These were some of his views. Cistercian monasteries emphasized poverty, purity, work, and each monastic enclave possessed highly organized farms and grazing lands called granges. The estates and flocks of Cistercian monasteries yielded substantial profits. So despite having been founded in rebellion against the wealth of the commercial revolution, and as a response to criticism of some of these monasteries like Cluny that had a lot of facilities and a lot of wealth, the Cistercians actually became part of it. They became part of that system. Now, I want you to look at this. This is Cluny from the 12th century, and I want you to look at this and consider why historians consider this church to be the most opulent in medieval Europe. What about it suggests grandeur? What about it is awe-inspiring? So some of the things that you might notice is that it has very high ceilings. It has a large amount of seating. There are elaborate mosaics and lots of stained glass windows. All of these things come together to suggest grandeur. Stained glass in particular would have been quite expensive and laborious to create. These were quite labor-intensive pieces of art to produce. Now, how might this church have been off-putting for other monks? Other monks may have believed that the church was too opulent. We do know that some monks had this criticism about some of these monasteries. And oftentimes their criticisms would be along the lines of grandeur like this is detracting. It's a distraction from piety. And it distracts from the purpose of monastic and religious life. It's not really conducive to living a simple life. These would have been the criticisms that you would have heard. So just to give you an idea of what a monastery might have looked like, its floor plan, we have the floor plan of a Cistercian monastery. And so if you recall, you have these two wings in which you have a wing for the lay brothers, and you have a part of the monastery that is dedicated to prayer. So just kind of take a look at it, and you can, of course, pause the video and just get an idea of how that was set up. All right, on to the Crusades. Lots of people look forward to talking about the Crusades, so hopefully you find it to be interesting. The Crusades brought together the traditions of pilgrimage and holy war. So it combined these two elements of Christian expression, and it established a European presence in the Middle East that lasted about 2 centuries. It's not as long as maybe you might have thought, or maybe that's shorter than you might have thought. The First Crusade was called in response to the Byzantine Emperor's request for help against a new wave of Muslim invasions by the Sunni Seljuk Turks. So we've already talked about Sunni and Shia, these two different sects of Muslims, and the Seljuk Turks adhered to the Sunni portion of that faith, and so the Byzantine Empire was under threat from Seljuk Turks. Now, in response to this, we have this interesting episode in which the Pope puts out this call, supposedly, and it gets broadcast throughout Europe, that people are needed. They're needed to go free the Holy Land from Muslims, from these Turks. So it's important to note as well that there was a lot of weakness in the Muslim world, and by 1050, back to the Seljuk Turks, they had conquered Baghdad and they'd begun to attack Byzantine territory. At the Battle of Manzikert, a mercenary imperial army was defeated, and the Byzantine Emperor Romanus was captured. The Turks then swept across the Middle East, and they took Jerusalem from its Fatimid rulers. In 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I, who we saw in, if you've already taken a look at the Rise of Kingdoms lecture, Alexius I was Alexius Comnenus, who came up through the Dinotoi. He appealed to Pope Urban II for help. And his hope was that he could get some new mercenary troops for a fresh offensive. So in response, Pope Urban II called upon a wide range of Christians to take up arms and reclaim the Holy Land from what he called the wicked race. And so, like I said, we have this interesting episode in which the Pope calls for crusade, and it sweeps Europe, and Europe undergoes this sort of crusade fever. One of the reasons for that is that he offered indulgences to those who were willing to respond to his call. Now, historians are divided about Urban's goals. But certainly he hoped to increase the power of the papacy, and he hoped to organize the entire race of Franks, to put it in his words, into a peace militia dedicated to holy purposes. In other words, he hoped to create an army of God. Urban's call gave the papacy a new role in military matters. Between 60,000 and 10,000 people undertook the journey to fight for the Holy Land. And they were motivated by a mix of piety and the desire to gain land. They saw opportunity, but they also wanted to express their own piety. So remember, the Crusades became this interesting mix of pilgrimage and holy war. And many women and old men and children participated in this first crusade. It wasn't just 20-something-year-old men, 20, 30, 40-something-year-old men. There were a lot of people who went on this crusade and answered the call for crusade. So just to give you an idea of some of the routes that people took to go to the Holy Land, this is a great map for that, and it shows you some of the areas that they marched through. And what's really interesting, and we'll talk about this, is that as they marched through some of these areas, not everybody was super happy about it. Not everybody was super excited to see these crusaders coming through. So the armies of the First Crusade were not an organized military force by any means, but they were actually a series of what we might call militias, and there was no cohesive command or anything like that. So it was really, these were separate militias. One band, for example, was made up of a number of loosely affiliated armed commoners. They were led by a man named Peter the Hermit. He was called Peter the Hermit, and this crusade was known as the People's Crusade. They departed earlier than, those who we would have thought of as more the aristocratically led crusade. These were very much commoners. They often didn't have very much, and they actually jumped on it pretty quickly and started on their journey before some of these better armed militias came through. In part because they were inspired by fiery and charismatic orators. Even Peter the Hermit was known for really getting people riled up. So on its way to the Holy Land, this band that became known as the People's Crusade made a deliberate detour to the Rhineland. And remember, if you look back at that map, I mentioned that not everybody was happy about some of these crusaders coming through their territories, because when this group got to the Rhineland, they actually took the time to attack Jewish communities in a series of pogroms, and they killed hundreds of people. The members of the People's Crusade who eventually made it to the Holy Land were actually shipped off to Asia, and most of them died. So really just kind of all around a very tragic episode in the history of the Crusades. Lots of tragic episodes in the history of the Crusades, and this is one of them. The main Crusader armies arrived in autumn, and after a lot of squabbling, they eventually promised the Byzantine Emperor Alexius that they would return any land that they conquered to him. And we're going to see that they don't follow through on this promise. On June 18th, 1097, they took Nicaea, and they dutifully handed it over to Alexius. However, this was probably the only promise that they kept, because we next see another group taking over the city of Edessa, and they created the first of the Crusader states from this. And of course, Alexius was upset by this. The main body of Crusaders eventually defeated a Turkish army at Antioch after an 8-month siege. And so this initial phase was seen as being rather successful. From Antioch, the Crusaders planned to capture Jerusalem, but disputes and divisions delayed their efforts. Divisions among the Muslims finally gave the Crusaders the chance to attack Jerusalem, and they captured the city in July of 1099. And in the process, they slaughtered a lot of the population. This was wholesale slaughter. They were not judicious at all about who they slaughtered. And there are really some barbaric stories that come out of this period. And so this is a statue of a crusader. It's a sculpture of a crusader. And just taking a look at it, what you can see is that in this statue, the church has taken on a martial role. And you almost get this image that the church's role is to rid the world of evil forces, and to do that militaristically. And Islam, during this time period, was considered one of these evil forces. It's really interesting because in years prior, Christians and Muslims had gotten along and had interacted with one another. We saw that with the Abbasids. Now, if you take a look at this, would you say that this is an inspiring statue for medieval peoples? Why or why not? For me, the statue could be seen as inspiring. The knight really has a sense of purpose or duty, and the horse and knight look straight ahead and they're moving forward. You don't get any sense that there's any kind of regret here or any kind of introspection about whether this is the right thing to do. But it's really kind of difficult because this piece really doesn't elicit a great sense of emotion. So it's not like, if you recall from the lecture on Hellenistic Greece, this isn't a statue like the boxer. This is really a lot more simplistic, and was probably intended to be. Now, the victorious leaders of the First Crusade retained the lands that they had conquered and established lordships. And this is in direct defiance of what they had promised to Alexius I, the Byzantine emperor. And in establishing these lordships, the lords extended fiefs to their vassals. When most of the Crusaders went home, the rulers who remained built castles. In fact, throughout this region, you can see a number of castles still today, the remains of many of these Crusader castles. And these rulers worked with what was now a mixed indigenous population, and they encouraged trade to flourish. We see a new militant monasticism that takes root in this area. And the best example of that is the Knights Templar. They took vows of chastity and obedience and promised to protect pilgrims. So the idea is that now that the Holy Land, now that Jerusalem is a Christian territory, this is freed up. This is going to allow more people to go on pilgrimage. And so the Knights Templar, one of their missions was to protect these pilgrims who are coming from the west to visit Jerusalem, to visit these holy places. So The Knights Templar get their names from their living quarters in the area near the former Jewish temple at Jerusalem. The Order of the Knights Templar protected pilgrimage routes from Palestine to Jerusalem, and they manned town garrisons of the Crusader states. They also transported a lot of money from Europe to the Holy Land, and there have been a lot of subsequent stories and myths that have arisen out of this. It's really interesting. They controlled quite a bit of money, and they became wealthy and powerful in their own right, and established branches across Europe, branches of the Knights Templar. So just so you have an idea of what the Crusader states look like following the First Crusades, here's a map, and you can see that this is the area that we now today know of as Israel. It doesn't encompass all of the territory of Europe, and you can see as well that the Crusader states go up into Syria and along the northern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and this is not what today is modern Israel, but still this gives you a sense of what these Crusader states looked like. Now, the Seljuk Turks retook Edessa in 1144. So in response, a new pope named Eugenius III called a second crusade. And in doing so, this second crusade attracted the monarchs Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany to the cause. And we've already talked about Louis VII in the lecture on the kingdoms. So hopefully you're familiar with him. Eugenius and the charismatic and influential Cistercian abbot known as Saint Bernard attempted to launch crusades within Europe. They hoped to encourage German nobles to focus not on the Holy Land, but on conquering the pagans on the Baltic coast, and on trying to support Alfonso VI in his attempt to reconquer Spain in Castile's Reconquista. So these are some ongoing efforts to continue to Christianize Europe. The Second Crusade was really poorly planned. It was not well thought out. And in addition to that, Conrad and Louis failed to coordinate with each other and with the Crusader states. No one was talking to each other. They were badly hurt by Turkish attacks, and in July of 1148, they attacked Damascus, but failed to take it. They were not successful, and they suffered heavy casualties. In the aftermath of the failed crusade, Louis VII divorced Eleanor of Aquitaine, accusing her of infidelity. And what's interesting is she had actually accompanied him on some of his incursions. But for whatever reason, he decided to divorce her. Remember, she was a pretty strong person, and their marriage was actually annulled by the Pope. Eleanor was then remarried to Henry, the Count of Anjou, who became Henry II of England in 1154. And so there's some context for you on these monarchies. Despite 8 major crusades between 1096 and the end of the 13th century, the Crusader states fell to the Muslims in 1291. Europeans never committed the resources necessary to preserve them. The Crusades stimulated trade, and they created more modern taxation systems, while they also sparked new notions of expedition and exploration. And we can see this in what would later be Christopher Columbus's journey. So this sort of develops in Europeans this mindset of going on journeys, of exploring areas, and going on expeditions. It takes Europeans outside of Europe and inspires this drive to discover. Now, the Crusades worsened, but did not create Islamic disunity. The brutality of the Crusades actually shocked Muslims, who before the Crusades had experienced really serious divisions between the Sunni and the Shiite. So following the Crusades, This is going to change. You're going to see more division between Muslims and Christians. Less tolerance between Muslims and Christians. So the Crusades have had a profound impact on relations between Muslims and Christians. We also see the development of new religious orders. We see new urban-based religious orders that thrived as this new religious enthusiasm set in. The Crusades are emblematic of that enthusiasm that was sweeping over Europe. The most famous of the Orthodox movements was founded by St. Francis of Assisi, and he lived during the 12th century, during the latter years of the 12th century through 1226. Francis of Assisi was actually born into a wealthy family. He was well-to-do. And religious introspection led Francis to renounce his wealth in favor of a simple life of preaching. So he gave up everything to do this, renounced everything that he owned to go out and live as the poor lived. He attracted many followers and had his friars recognized as a religious order that spread across Europe, particularly in urban areas. And so the Franciscans become an important arm of the church. Clare, we find a noblewoman named Clare who was a follower of Francis, and she actually established the Sisters of St. Francis in 1212. Unfortunately, these women were eventually confined to cloisters under the Benedictine rule. So initially this gave women a way to express their piety by going out into the streets and working with the poor, but realities being what they were, eventually they're confined to cloisters and are not able to do these things anymore. Now, many women were part of this revival of religion, and one group that we know of that were known as the Beguines. These were societies of lay women who lived together in informal communities that accepted celibacy and served the poor. So they weren't necessarily what we would think of as nunneries. These were generally not formal arrangements. These were very informal communities. But the Beguines encouraged emotional and ecstatic religious experiences, and they were very attractive. These orders were very attractive to lay women who oftentimes didn't have other means to express this. In addition to Orthodox religious movements, we also see an explosion of religious ideas at the end of the 12th century, and this included some that contradicted church doctrine and even threatened church authority. And they were constantly labeled heresies. Dualism was the most common heresy. This is the notion that the world was torn between forces of good and evil. And it's a lot more complex than that. And so I encourage you that if you're interested in looking at some of these heresies, to do some further research and understand what was going on and what their doctrine entailed and why the church would have seen it as threatening, because it really is quite fascinating. What we see happening is that at a place called Languedoc in southern France, there was a branch of dualism known as Albigensianism that emerged. These people were also known as the Cathars. These were dualists who taught that the devil had created the material world, and so they renounced wealth, meat, and sex and denied the authority of the church hierarchy. Other groups, such as the Waldensians in the 1170s, preached extreme poverty and renounced the church's authority. So the church hierarchy really didn't like these groups. They really saw them as a threat and really wanted to get rid of them. And as a result of this, we see crusades against these people to kind of stamp them out. Now, the Third Crusade, let's talk about the Third Crusade a little bit. The Seljuk Empire fell apart in the 12th century. But we have someone named Nur al-Din and his successor Saladin. That might be familiar to you. Between the two of them, they united Syria and Egypt and conquered the Crusader state of Jerusalem in 1187. The Third Crusade was led by the strongest European kings: Frederick I of Barbarossa, Philip II of France, Richard I, Richard the Lionhearted of England, and Leopold of Austria. However, they were by no means united, and as a result of that, this disunity led the Third Crusade to accomplish very little, although it did weaken the Byzantine Empire. That was kind of maybe the unintended consequence of that. During the Fourth Crusade, prejudice and religious zeal combined to persuade many of the Crusaders to change their plans and capture Constantinople instead of Jerusalem. This is interesting because it's changed focus. The leaders of the Fourth Crusade were convinced by the Venetians, who were charged with transporting them to the Holy Land. The Venetians convinced these Crusaders to sack the Christian cities of Zara and Constantinople in order to defray expenses. The idea was, hey, you guys are going on crusade? Well, why don't you go over there to these cities, and they've got a lot of riches, and if you just conquer them, then it's going to pay for your crusade. Now, while he opposed the sacking of Constantinople, once it had been accomplished, the Pope ordered the crusading army to occupy it for a year to consolidate the influence of Western Christianity. The Crusaders never actually made it to the Holy Land. Other crusades to the Holy Land were called up until the 15th century, but none of them attracted very much support, and so we just see this crusading fever dying off. So another map that shows you some of the routes that some of these crusades took. And you can see some of the, if you look at, for example, the arrows in orange, they're orange on my screen, you can see the crusade against the Albigensians, and we will talk about that, as well as some of the attacks in Spain from Christians on Muslims that still controlled some of those areas in an attempt to Christianize Spain. All right, so let's talk about, let's touch on these crusades that actually occurred in Europe. During the 1140s, the kings of Portugal, Castile, and Aragon, remember Spain is by no means a consolidated territory. It's a lot of these different provinces, these little kingdoms. So we have the kings of Portugal, Castile, and Aragon sending victorious armies against Muslim cities in Spain. The Spanish Muslims failed to unite against this threat, and so this really undermines their ability to defend against these invasions by these Christian kings. In addition, Berber invasions from the south had weakened Al-Andalus, and this meant that Christians were taking pieces of Al-Andalus piecemeal. And this helped to weaken Al-Andalus further. At Las Navas de Tolosa, there was a decisive defeat at the hands of the kings of Aragon and Castile, and this led to further Christian successes. The Reconquista concluded in 1492. That should be a familiar year to you. And it resulted in an eastern kingdom of Aragon, a middle kingdom of Castile, and a western kingdom of Portugal. And we're going to see, when we start to talk about them, we're going to see that Ferdinand and Isabel are going to unify these areas. And they will be the monarchs that sponsor Christopher Columbus's voyage. The Northern Crusades began in the 12th century, and they lasted intermittently until the 15th. Initial attacks were uncoordinated and led by the Danish king Valdemar I, as well as by the Saxon Duke Henry the Lion. Some pagan Slavic princes accepted Christianity and retained their lands, while others were conquered and given to Christian rulers. Cistercian monks built monasteries in the conquered lands west of the Oder River, and German tradesmen and colonists followed and came to dominate Baltic shipping. So this really changes the economic life of these areas. There were long-lasting effects of the conquest on the Baltic area, as it adopted medieval European institutions from then on, outside of Lithuania, which resisted conquest and conversion for still some time. The Dominicans and other religious orders were charged by the Pope with preaching against the Cathar heresy. So we move over to the portions of France and Spain. And one of the reasons that they were preaching against the Cathar heresy was because they practiced radical poverty. But frustrated with the lack of progress and the murder of a papal legate, the Pope in 1208 demanded that northern princes invade Languedoc and populate the land with Orthodox Christians. This is where we get the Albigensian Crusade. It lasted from 1209 to 1229. 20 years, and offered crusaders the same spiritual benefits of campaigning in the Holy Land. So if you recall, indulgences, land, there were lots of promises that were given if the crusaders took these areas and Christianized them. The Capetian kings of France took up the crusade, and by 1229 the Cathar princes had been defeated. So just a map, going back to what we were talking about with Spain, this is just a map of what Spain came to look like after the Reconquista. So just to finish up our discussion on the rise of church power, it's really interesting because we see throughout these areas, in combination with the solidification of power under the kingdoms and the solidification of church power, this is a time period in which a lot of castles were built. And this is really interesting development because these castles tell us something about how people viewed a lot of these episodes, how they experienced this crusading that was going on, particularly in these parts of Europe. So this is Almoral Castle, and I want you to take a look at it and think about it as a symbol of the threats to power at this time. What about it indicates that it is a symbol of these threats to power? So some of the things that you might think about is that it's a pretty imposing structure. I mean, it's a massive structure and very imposing. It also sits up on a hill above a river, has high walls. All of this suggests the need to be aware of who was coming and to protect against attacks from outside invaders. And so a lot of these castles exhibit these characteristics. A lot of these Crusader era castles look like this. They take advantage of the features of the land to build these defensive structures. Now, why were Christian forces willing to use Muslim strongholds for protection if they were unwilling to accept the middle ground in other areas, such as conversion? The Christians' attitude toward Muslim strongholds highlights the importance of religious beliefs at this time, as well as the sense of imminent danger that all sides felt. The Christians would be willing to make compromises on security, but no such compromise was possible in religious matters. So one of the things to think about is that at this time, in this time period of crusading and this growth of church power, what we see is a hardening of religious ideology and its ability to sort of get along with other religious groups. And we see this among a lot of these religious groups, between Islam and Christianity in particular, and Christianity and some of these heresies, that people are becoming very hardened in their beliefs and unwilling to compromise. And a lot of that has to do with the level of violence that people are subject to. And so the Albigensian Crusade is a good example of this. This map is an area. It shows that area of France. This is the area between France and Spain. And you can see this was a very mountainous area, and so one of the reasons why the Crusades took 20 years is because it is a more rugged terrain, and it was a challenge to kind of root out this heresy as some of these heretics, these so-called Cathars, holed up in some of these areas and fought off these crusaders. But that gives you an idea of where these people were actually living and where they were pocketed. So it's interesting to note that you see just little pockets of it throughout these parts of Europe, throughout Western Europe. And just to finish us off, by 1215, this gives you an idea of what the Western world looked like. And just to give you an idea of how England is still kind of has its toehold into the continent, you can see that it still has control of Aquitaine, that the monarch of England still had control of Aquitaine, which is going to continue to bring it into conflict with the monarch of France for quite some time.